Hello, my name's Winford Dorr and I want to talk to you about the neurology of perfect golf, or perfect any other sport for that matter. Well, there are three very different elements required to learn a skill properly. We know about good coaching, that's absolutely critical. Secondly, we also know about we must practice, and most of us do that as well. But the third is equally as important as the other two, and that's the ability of the brain to develop that type of skill. So we focus on the first two, but usually we don't know what we can do about the ability of our brain to develop that type of skill. So that's what I want to talk about, because it can explain the limitations we have, the inconsistencies we have, the emotional overload we have. So let's get stuck in. Well, there are two fundamental parts to creating a skill. And one is our physiological or orthopedic aspects, our fitness, our flexibility, our strength and so on. But the second is the ability for that neurological information that's needed to fit it all together, to give the instructions to the body. And that information is going to come from the integration of our various senses, the integration of what we see, of our balance, maybe even what we hear, and in some situations what we taste and what we smell and what we touch. If we're inconsistent, for instance, some of our drives are perfect and then we do a duff one, or when we're putting, the length control isn't always what it should be, or the direction, or the speed, how we read the greens, all of these inconsistencies can be explained. And as we know, more coaching, more practice doesn't always cure them. There's that glass ceiling comes in. So let's talk about the neurological elements that go into developing skills. And it's not just motor skills, the actual motor element of what we need to do to create movement and strike balls and so on, but there's also our emotional skills, our social skills, our attentional skills. These are all things that are developed by a similar process using a part of the brain called the cerebellum. It's the link between brain and body. It's a bit like a room full of computer coders that code up all the different elements that go into making life easy and consistent and good, or not, as the case may be. And the cerebellum is the one that makes it such that some of us are good at math, some aren't, some are good at art, some aren't, some are good at putting, some aren't, and so on. All of the differences that occur between people can usually be explained by the ability of the cerebellum to develop, or not, different types of skills. So let's take an example, putting, something that bugs quite a few people. It's a motor skill in the main. How do we learn how to putt? Well, usually we get a good coach, and the coach shows us the best technique that he or she can give us, how to address the ball, how to focus, how to hold the club, how to move, etc., etc. Loads of elements in that technique. And all of the inputs we need for our brain to process and perform those elements of the technique includes lots of input from our different senses. So our stance, for instance, requires lots of information from our balance organ. That's our vestibular. That's the bit here with squiggly bits behind our ears. We also need for our stance gross motor. That's the ability to move properly and accurately the limbs of our body and coordinate it with the balance. Then another sensory input is processing what we see, what we are looking at, what the information we're taking in visually through our eyes. And then there's another aspect of what we're seeing visually, and that's our spatial awareness, judging distances, judging direction. All of these are different sensory inputs, and there's loads of them. Then we've got our feelings through our fingers, and some aspects of that are called fine motor controls, when we're holding our putter so that we deliver the correct speed and direction and feel to the ball. These are several of many sensory inputs that are needed for us to develop automaticity and consistency in putting. And the final one I'll just talk about briefly is the movement of our body, our arms. That's a gross motor skill, and all of that's got, of course, got to be linked with our balance and coordination. So when you're being coached, when you're practicing, you are thinking about it. You're processing all of the things you've got to do in your thinking brain, and the thinking brain is working very, very hard. Now, as you know, you're not in the zone if you're doing much thinking. It's too much overload, too many things to think about, and you end up performing pretty badly when you are using your thinking brain at all. So what you try and do is you try and memorize it, you try and hardwire it, and practice does that to an extent. You do lots of practice and you're trying to make it more and more automatic so you don't have to think about everything. And when things become automatic, so you don't have to think about them, they're processed up here in the cortex. When you're having to think about it, it's the front of the brain here, the prefrontal cortex. So two fundamentally different parts of the brain. And don't forget, it's the cerebellum here that makes all the difference. So we're talking about the cerebellum here, the cortex up here, and the prefrontal cortex. Sorry about this, so much neurology, but it's really important to you. But when things are processed here in the thinking brain, they're roughly 100,000 times slower than when they're processed up here. So that's why when you're thinking about something, you're not going to be as good. You're not going to be as consistent. It's going to be more emotional and more hard work. Because anything that happens here is really hard work. So what's processed up here, when it's become fully automatic and you've perfected it, is so much faster and much more consistent and less work. Is that making some sense? So what's actually going on in the process of learning putting? Well, when you try and putt, first of all, there's an instruction from the motor part of your brain. It says, right, you're going to putt. And the brain looks for, what instructions have I got on how to putt? You don't think about this, it's all happening in the subconscious. But in the cerebellum, there's two different files of instructions for putting. One of them is called the internal model. Now, that is a file that's got a picture of what it looks like when putting is done correctly and the type of putt you want to do. So there'll be a picture there, the internal model. This is what happens when it's done right. Then there's another file, and these are all the steps that the brain must take in the correct order so that you deliver that putt perfectly so it looks like the picture you've got in your mind of what should happen. Okay, two files. Internal model, what it looks like, inverse model, all the steps. And that inverse model, all those steps, is going to include all the details about the balance information you need to get from the vestibular to build that into the instructions. All of the visual and spatial information you need to get to build into the instructions you putt. And then there's going to be the fine motor skills, the instructions for your fingers, how you're holding the club and how much pressure you use. And then there's the gross motor instructions, all of your movements. So all of these sensory inputs are critical, and they must all be put together to create perfect, precise instructions in the muscles, which muscles to fire off in the right order, how much, how far, and so on. And then you putt. And what happens? Oh, it just went a little bit wide of the hole, or it stopped short. Do you know what? That wasn't perfect, was it? It's not what you wanted. So in other words, what was in the internal model, what it looked like to do it perfectly, wasn't what is executed. So there's a message goes back from your muscles to the cerebellum saying, this is what happened when I did that. And it compares what happened with what should have happened. And there's a gap, there's an error message. And the cerebellum then works on that error message and saying, how can I adjust those instructions in the inverse model so that that doesn't happen again, so it improves. So that process is exactly what happens in the cerebellum as we learn. And of course, after the cerebellum analyzes it and corrected it, you then have another go, and it uses the new, slightly adjusted set of instructions in the cerebellum the next time you perform it. And there's a different error. The feedback goes back to the cerebellum and it adjusts it again. And this process continues and continues and continues, keeps tweaking it, if you like, in the hope that eventually you stop making that error. Well, hopefully at least the error is getting better as the process repeats and the fine-tuning continues. But you know what happens? Sometimes you find you hit a glass ceiling. And it doesn't matter how much coaching you have, it doesn't matter how much practice you do, that skill never quite gets perfect. Wow, so irritating. Well, here's the reason. To achieve perfection and consistency in these skills, every one of those sensory inputs from your eyes, from your balance organ, from your body, from your fingers and so on, must be perfectly connected, must be perfectly integrated. And there's thousands of different combinations of those senses that need connecting properly. We assume that they're all integrated, but of course they're not. And, you know, I've lost count, for instance, of how many people who come up to me and say, oh, I've got perfect balance integration. Do you? And I ask them, stand on one leg with your eyes closed. Well, most of them fall over within a few seconds. The odd one that doesn't fall over, I say, okay, stand up on one leg, shut your eyes, and then put your head on one shoulder. And the rest always fall over. Now, those are just one of a countless number of sensory integrations that for that person haven't yet been fully developed. And as a result, any skill that they require that requires that combination of sensory inputs is going to be severely impaired. You know, I'll remember testing a Formula One driver once, and he'd got fantastic visual response, incredible speed of visual response when he was looking straight ahead. Incredible. Then I checked his response time for his peripheral vision. And that was what was happening out here. In other words, not one in his main line of vision, but out here. And the response time for that was, wow, way slower than the average person. So it was really bad. Do you know what? And that's the reason why he was really on the podium. Well, there's many thousands of different sensory inputs that we need to integrate, and every one of them needs to be perfectly integrated if it's going to be used in a skill that you're trying to automatize. That's the role of the cerebellum. And if any of them are needed and aren't fully integrated properly, then you're going to need some thought to execute that particular skill. You're going to have to think about it. And you know what? You want to be in the zone where you're not thinking about anything. And don't forget, whenever you have to think, whenever any particular element of a skill requires some conscious thought to compensate for the fact that it's not fully hardwired, then this bit is going to be 100,000 times slower than what's happening up here. That's going to make it much slower, much less precise, much harder work too. So any one of those sensory inputs could be messing up the perfection you're aiming for, the precision you're aiming for, the consistency you want in the skills you're trying to develop. Well, when that happens, it doesn't matter how much coaching you have or how much you practice, the cerebellum cannot finish the job because the data it's getting is too slow and it's unreliable. Well, there's only one way to break through that glass ceiling, and that's to develop the cerebellum so that the cerebellum can systematically rectify the faults in your sensory integration. It can look for all of them, audit them all, find out where the weaknesses are and work on it and create you a complete set of integrated senses so that when you need them in skills, you don't have to think about it. They're there ready to plug into that skill and deliver precision, deliver consistency. So when you've got there, that processing can take place with no need for help from the thinking brain, and that takes you really close to perfection, you know. Well, there's some good news at the end of all this, and that's all the practice you've done up to now hasn't been wasted. You don't have to start again. Why? Because the thinking brain, the cerebellum, has stored all of your practice in the internal model and the inverse model. You might not be able to use it because some of that sensory integration hasn't been finished off, but all of the practice is there. So you've got an awful lot of data. So when you've worked on the cerebellum to improve its own ability to integrate all those senses, Usually it can use all of that data you've carefully developed by doing all of that coaching and practice and use it to finish off the job of creating that perfected, hardwired skill that gives you consistency. So if you're stuck with any limitation in any part of your game, don't shoot your coach. Don't even beat up yourself. Blame your cerebellum and set about fixing it. All the best.